Hello and welcome to WoWFEST Lockdown, Writing on the Walls online festival designed to keep you stimulated, engaged and to grapple with some of the questions raised by the current pandemic and the situation that we find ourselves in. Apologies for lateness. Thank you for your patience and bearing with us. We've had some technical problems, as they say. If you've been with us from the beginning for the festival, I think you'll agree that it's been an incredible month. If you missed any events or joined them late, you can catch up with them on our Facebook page. I'm Madeline Hennigan. I'm your host for the first event of an incredible double bill that we've got tonight. Playing out will be internationally renowned poet, urban griot, Toxteth-based Levi Tafari. Well, first of all, I'm very proud to welcome to WoWFEST for the very first time, Jeremy Corbyn, MP for Islington North and former leader of the Labour Party. And Jeremy is a political veteran, really, a veteran activist. He's been around for all of my political life, particularly through Stop the War Coalition. And he's marched alongside us for numerous causes, including supporting the NHS and an end to austerity. But incredibly, Jeremy Corbyn managed to garner the support of young people like no other British politician. Many young people took an interest in politics for the first time, and he brought a whole new generation into the Labour Party who felt that there was finally something worth voting for and campaigning for. And within the groundswell of youth support arose Grind for Corbyn, the Grind for Corbyn movement that speaks for some of the most marginalised young people in society. Stormzy led the campaign and he pronounced that Jeremy Corbyn is the first man in a position of power who is committed to giving that power back. But it wasn't just the grime community. Whole swathes of the artistic community rallied around his election campaign, recognising his commitment not only to the arts, but to a more fair and just society. And from the Glastonbury stage, a moment that will go down in musical and political history, Jeremy Corbyn proclaimed that in every child there's a poem, in every child there's a painting, in every child there's music. And in November 2019, in his Arts for All charter, he set out a strategy to give every child the opportunity to be creative and to access the art. The charter pledged £1 billion for Arts Fund, another £1 billion for youth services, and 175 million annual arts pupil premium. And interestingly, for organisations like us, more transparency in the allocation of funding. In short, Jeremy Corbyn just got the arts. He understands the impact on the health and well-being, on community cohesion, and the quality and life and happiness for society. In this crisis that has been brought about by the pandemic, the arts have made a brilliant contribution, really stepping up while people are in lockdown. But the arts are also facing another kind of crisis, financial crisis, which seems to be long-term, and artists hit the hardest. Those who produce our art are going to be suffering the most. So in the midst of this crisis, we invite Jeremy Corbyn to issue his call to arts. Can you give him a big virtual welcome to Writing on the Wall?
Thank you very much for that wonderful and over-generous introduction. It's a great honour to be here. I'm really sorry I'm not actually in Liverpool doing it there, because I I love Liverpool. I love the buzz of the city, and I love the buzz of Merseyside. So it would be fantastic. So if you'll allow me to come again in future years, I'd be delighted to physically be there doing it. But COVID means that we are locked down, we are confined to our own places. And I'm doing this from my study at home, which I think started life as a garage in my house, but I converted it because I haven't got a car. And at the back of me there, you see that painting with the sky over the hills there. That is a commemoration of the mass trespass of Kinder Scout in 1932, when Benny Rothman led a huge contingent of working class people, mainly from Manchester, to show that the land is ours and we can all walk there. He was arrested, of course, and he was imprisoned, as were others, but the right to roam was eventually won. And that is part of that inspiration. And he makes the point in his message that access to the countryside gives him the inspiration to think, to write stuff, and of course the poetry that comes from it. And further behind that is another painting, which is right down there, which is of Italian demonstration. There's lots of red flags and red balloons from Emilia Romagna, which is historically the strongest left area of Italy. It was done by a great friend of mine's father, who very kindly sent it to me and gave me the painting to keep here to remind me of the needs of people all over the world to be able to express themselves. And the festival we're taking part in now has, of course, origins in the dock strike in Liverpool, the defence of jobs, the defence of skilled work, the defence of a whole culture that went with the city of Liverpool. And it was my privilege to be in Liverpool during those days, supporting the dockers and supporting that strike and the work that went with it. And what impressed me was there was always space for music, there was always space for poetry, there was always space for culture in that struggle, as indeed in all struggles, because it isn't bread or roses. You can't really have one without the other. In the poorest places, in the most desperate situations all around the world, people look to music, look to poetry, and look to art at a time of great desperation. I'll give you an example. Some years ago, I was visiting a refugee camp in the Congo, the Democratic Republic of Congo. And it was a terrible situation for the people, mainly women and children in this camp. There was violence all around them. Rape was being used as a weapon of war. And there were militia gangs effectively working on behalf of multinational corporations to steal the natural resources of their country. And their only place of safety for them were these refugee camps. And they were getting some food via the UN. They weren't allowed to grow any, which was bizarre. So they got big oil drums, cut holes in the side, filled them with soil, and grew cabbages coming out the side of the oil drums on the basis that they weren't allowed to grow food in the ground. They could grow it in the air, and an oil drum was in the air compared to the ground. They won the argument. But they also played music. They also put on plays. They also encouraged their children to learn music and to sing and to dance and to imagine what life could be when that horrible war was over. So when you said at the beginning, you quoted something that I had said at the launch of our Arts Manifesto in the general election last year, that there is a piece of music in all of us. There is a poem in all of us. There is a painting in all of us. And we shouldn't be afraid of it. We shouldn't be ashamed of it. We shouldn't be embarrassed by it. We should be happy for it, because it is what makes the world go round. Too much of classical music is often based on what was written, what happened in 17th, 18th, 19th century Europe. Now, there is amazing music. I think probably the greatest musician of all time was probably Ludwig van Beethoven. And I make no apologies for it. I love classical music. I'm not very musical, but I love classical music. I love all forms of music. But in those days, a very small number of people had access to writing music. A small proportion of the population were literate, and music was in effect the plaything of the very rich. And so the symphonies were written for royalty, to celebrate battles, to celebrate coronations, and so on. There was also lots of popular music which was never written down, was never recorded, was part of the oral tradition of history. And so now we have the ability to record, the ability to keep, the ability to know what's happening all around the place. We've never had a greater ability to communicate with each other. And sometimes we build unbelievable barriers to stop ourselves communicating with each other. Sometimes those barriers are in the mind. One of my inspirations in how we tried to develop our music policy was I wanted there to be a pupil arts premium for every school, ring-fenced, so that every child would have a chance to learn a musical instrument, have access to the theatre, have access to art in school. We've had 10 years of austerity. During that time, many music teachers have lost their jobs. Many schools have cut back on art. Many schools have cut back on practical subjects, woodwork, metalwork, and so on, and DTI and all this, and have gone to core subjects because that's what they've got the money left to do. I had a visit some years ago to Faith Primary School in Liverpool. Amazing. Every child there is learning music, and they're supported by the Philharmonic, Liverpool Philharmonic, and it is a fantastic example of what can be achieved in that school, and I pay absolute compliment to them. They even tried to get me playing the violin, and there was an incredibly patient 10-year-old trying to teach me the violin. Kind of worked for a couple of chords, and that was about it, really. But it gave me the incentive to develop the idea of a ring-fence budget for the arts, because that would mean it would have to be spent on the arts, but it could also be used to filter through to local theatres, local music, and everything else. And it would also be a support for those theatres, but it would also encourage local education authorities to not just support the local theatres, but also support music space, so that young people developing their music can then have somewhere to practice and somewhere to rehearse. And pubs could be perhaps encouraged to encourage live music rather than prevent it actually happening, because that music scene that's developed all around Liverpool and Merseyside came from young people playing together, finding a pub where they could perform, or a music hall or something, or a church, and somewhere to rehearse and practice. We need to make sure that creativity is always there and has the space to develop. And so I think we have to think of the arts in terms of accessibility for all. And that attitude would be improved by more spending on it, but it would also be a recognition of the value to the development of the individual within our society, but also actually the economic benefit. There is a huge cultural benefit to our community and our economy by the development of music, arts, and so on. And I think the corona crisis has taught us all a lot of things. Firstly, that there is no hiding place around the world from health inequality. And so if somebody somewhere in the world contracts a virus that is hitherto unknown, it can spread very, very rapidly. Where there is a health and social care system that is properly run, the effects of that virus are less than in places where there isn't a health and care system that is properly run and properly funded. The World Health Organization is there to ensure there is health care for all around the world. And this corona crisis has shown us just how dangerous it is to have so much health inequality in the world. It's also taught us to value the poorest people who were once described as unskilled migrant workers, like cleaners in hospitals and schools and buses and trains. They're absolutely the most important people around because they help to keep us all safe. But what has also happened because of the lockdown has been the development of creativity. Lots of people have sent me poems they've written during the corona crisis, poems they've written in praise of care workers, doctors, nurses, and care homes, stuff they've written on the pavements, and children who come out during the 8 o'clock clap every week and draw with chalk stuff on the pavements. All of that shows that sense of creativity that's there in all of us, and I think that is really good. Now, the history of the state and public funding for the arts is a complicated one, because as local government developed from late 19th century, turn of the 20th century, its core functions were education, in those days public health, and of course later on housing and provision of planning and other kinds of services. The arts had a place in some local authorities. Some were very good and very progressive and did a great deal to support the arts. Some didn't. And I look at the history of the London County Council, which particularly from the 1930s onwards was very good at promoting arts and theatre and taking Shakespeare into schools and Shakespeare into parks and promoting open air theatres. Other councils all around the country did much the same thing. But it was the vision of Jenny Lee in the 1960s, who was the minister responsible for the establishment of both the Open University and the Arts Council in 1968, because she could see the levels of inequality that were there. A disproportionate number of our famous actors and actresses come from public schools because public schools have the money and the resources to promote acting and theatre. Others don't. And she felt the Arts Council would be there to ensure the proper funding of local theatres and development of arts for all. As with the Open University, the idea that it would develop education for all, irrespective of what your achievements had been in school. And I think we owe a great deal to Jenny Lee and what she achieved. The Arts Council is something I value, but I would question quite a lot of its sense of priorities. A wholly disproportionate amount of its resources go on national theatres, national endeavours and national events. Not saying they're not important, they are very important. But if we don't fund the basis of arts in this country, the local theatre, the local cinema, the local music venue, then where are the actors of tomorrow? Where are the musicians of tomorrow? And so I would look to a greater funding for the Arts Council, but also a requirement of a much fairer sense of funding all across the UK into the poorest areas of the country. And at the moment, during the corona crisis, the theatres are all going through the most incredible stress. A very good friend of mine who runs the theatre nearest to where I live in Finsbury Park in North London, he established the theatre a few years ago, which I strongly support. It has affordable prices and is something that is genuinely very accessible to the community. He's frightened, like all people trying to run theatres, on how they're going to possibly survive. They're desperately looking for funds at the present time. So when we come out of the corona lockdown, let's do two things. Not make the mistakes of 2010, when after the financial crisis, we poured lots of money into the banks to make them survive, and we paid for it by cutting public services, cutting local authority spending, cutting care spending, cutting arts spending, and everything else. We paid for that through austerity. This time, let's invest for the future, invest in a growing economy, invest in that whole range of services, including investment in the arts, because arts, culture, and sport are very much part of our society. Now, you very kindly mentioned when you were introducing me the event I went to during the 2017 general election. We're all live at the Tranmere Rovers ground, and I had come there from a sort of quite interesting day on the road in the election. I'd been to a rally in Birmingham. We then had to get up to Wirral to do an event with Margaret Greenwood, and unfortunately, the M6 was closed, so we had to take the highways and byways of the West Midlands going northwards into Cheshire and so on. And eventually, we arrived in Wirral, and we did a rally at West Kirby on the beach. We had thousands of people there, which was amazing, and we had to time it carefully because obviously there's no point in having a rally on the beach if the tides come in. So when that rally was finished, we left there. We then went over to the Tranmere Rovers ground for Wirral Live, and I was very kindly invited to speak at the same time as Reverend and the Makers were on. And so the words I used there was what I strongly believe. Working class culture gives us sport. Working class culture gives us music. The history of the struggle to get a band, to support a band, a brass band, a silver band, a skiffle band, an acoustic band, a high electronic band, all these things are all part of a cultural endeavor of people who haven't got a lot of resources, but they have an idea. Just in the same way that the culture surrounding football often brings those things together. And so I said there that I wanted to see a government in office in this country that would value and recognize the creativity that's there in all of us and recognize the voice of working class communities in our spoken word, in our written word, in our music, and in our theatre. There are so many great writers one could think about, fantastic writers. And those people that write often at times of stress and often at times of societal stress often produce the most amazing works. A good friend of mine is Ben Okri, a Nigerian writer who wrote The Famished Road and a number of other amazing books about life in Nigeria. He also writes poetry. He wrote quite a lot of The Famished Road in libraries while he was sleeping rough because he was destitute. And he eventually got the book finished, got it published, and now is able to live and write the most amazing works. But he writes with empathy. He writes with empathy for the society which he grew up in Nigeria. And he explained to me that the tensions of Nigeria going into independence and post-independence and all the problems of a neoliberal economic system and the poverty of people coming from rural areas and the lack of proper facilities in urban areas provides the spark for that writing and that determination for social justice. And I think those things are very, very important. Nearer to home, Walter Greenwood wrote Love on the Dole. A writer from Salford wrote Love on the Dole, which is a painful and poignant description of love amongst the poorest people in the most desperate times during the Great Depression of the 1930s. He gave voice to people. And above all, that voice empowered people, as did other writers, poets and others, all through the 1930s, that never again should we go back to the means test and the misery and the poverty of the wholly unnecessary austerity of the 1930s any more than we should have the austerity of the 2010-20 period. And please, not the austerity of 2020 onwards, if that is to be the solution to the corona crisis. So bear in mind the way in which writers can describe things. But it's also about film, about the development of film, cinema, and theatre. And radical cinema and radical theatre are a very, very important part of our lives and of our understanding about the way in which people lead their lives. After the Russian Revolution in 1917, there was an explosion of artistic freedom. Alexander Kollontai wrote a great deal of wonderful feminist literature. There was the social realism of the art movement of the time, and there was development of a radical film idea, the idea of the history of ordinary people, the history of peasants, the history of land grabbing and fighting back against land grabbing, the reality of what life had been like in Tsarist Russia. And do you know what the British establishment's reaction to this was? Ban them. Use the Lord Great Chamberlain and others to prevent that kind of stuff being shown. But there was always a radical movement that made sure that those films got through. And the power of the great radical filmmakers, people like Ted Willis, who rose to the very top in the whole film industry and was a great film writer, or Ken Loach, who we all know and love very well for I, Daniel Blake, for Cathy Come Home, and all the other films that he made. But also, he worked on Z-Cars. Z-Cars was gritty, just like Voice in the Black stuff was gritty, realistic, and encouraged us all to think. Did it disempower us, or did it empower us at the end of it? I think it actually empowered us. Likewise, those that developed our radical theatres and ensured that there was an arts for all principle. The way that the late great Joan Plowright developed the Theatre Royal in the East End of London and produced that wonderful play, Oh, What a Lovely War, which was, of course, a challenge to the whole way in which the First World War had been reported. And I remember watching a reproduction of that fantastic play as a young person. And for the first time, I began to question the history I'd been taught at school about what the First World War was about, because of the way in which she put that play together. And so we have to then think on how we're empowered by this sort of stuff. And then look at the great music that's come from working class communities all over the country. It's come from miners' bands, come from silver bands, from brass bands, and the pride and the principle of a band. And when we have the bands at the Durham Miners Gala every July, sadly this year it's going to be, I assume, another Zoom rally. There is that sense of pride in that community. Even though the pits are gone, the band is still there and indeed doing very well and stronger than ever. But there's also all the other music that's developed and the great music that's come out of Liverpool from the 1960s. Obviously, the Beatles are the best known, but there were so many others, the Scaffold and all the rest doing fantastic things. And it's still happening and still there because of that endless level of creativity amongst people. And last November, during the election campaign, what we did was put together a Sunday evening launch of our arts manifesto, and it formed an important part of the manifesto here. It's time for real change. And in that, we had an amazing variety of people coming along, and introduced, some by Rob Delaney and others. So we had singers, we had filmmakers, we had poets, we had songs, we had Billy Bragg, and many, many other people performed at that event to get across the message that we wanted people to be empowered by the liberation of art. And if you go into any school and you ask people how they're doing in school, particularly students, they sometimes give you monosyllabic answers or a bit suspicious about why the local MP's going around asking how they're doing. And then you see them doing music, or see them in an art thing, or see them writing or expressing poetry, and it's all very, very different because it's there for everybody. Everybody has something to say, and everybody has a poem in them. And that's why we wanted to ensure that arts for all and culture for all were there as a central part of our our manifesto, and I'm very proud that we did achieve that in there. And I hope that policy will pertain for all time. It'll be our call from the Labour movement that we are there for artists for all time. Now, that brings me on to the question of how we receive our information. And that is, of course, the question of the media within our society. The media and I have a complex relationship. I like to think they don't understand me. I understand them. Because the way in which radical views are put forward, the way in which individuals are denigrated, indeed monstered by the media, has an effect, even though less and less people actually buy or read a daily paper, and fewer and fewer, particularly young people, actually watch mainstream news on television or listen to it on the radio. It nevertheless has a powerful effect. And so I was thinking a lot about this. I absolutely support the freedom of expression. I'm totally signed up to the principles behind UNESCO, United Nations Scientific and Cultural Organization, Education Scientific and Cultural Organization. I'm totally signed up to the UN Convention on Human Rights and the European Convention on Human Rights, freedom of expression, freedom of the press, totally signed up to that. But we don't have freedom of the press. We have a media that's owned by a small number of people, and we have an amazingly collective agenda on them. Talk about herd instinct. Herd instinct is alive and well and living in the mainstream media in this country. And so I just think we need to have that voice. And therefore, what I was proposing was to end monopoly ownership within broadcasting and print media, to encourage local media, local newspapers, and recognize that the divide between broadcast and print is actually reducing all the time. Because in reality, if you go onto any newspaper's website, they normally have a huge amount of news coming on there by the minute almost, but also they have a lot of live stream stuff. So in reality, they're sort of broadcasting at the same time as producing a print newspaper. So we need to have that diversity of ownership within our media. Now, the BBC license is coming up for review, and the whole funding arrangements of the BBC are coming up for discussion and debate at the present time. Now, let's be clear. First of all, I do support the principle of public service broadcasting. I think it's an important principle that there be public service broadcasting and that it be independent of government and independent of the state. And in that sense, I would support the principle of the BBC. But I have to say, the news values of the BBC are something that I inherently challenge. The cultural values of the BBC, I think, need to be broadened massively. And I think there needs to be far greater accessibility to the BBC for music, art and culture in general, but also a very different approach to the way in which they should be reporting current affairs and public affairs and political things, rather than becoming a source of commentary on them the whole time. And I want to see a change in the way in which our broadcasting is done in the future. If you look at the way in which broadcasting has developed in the United States, particularly ever since the demise of US public broadcasting system, has been the growth of Fox News and the values that go with Fox News. And you now have a president of the United States that essentially, if he doesn't like a particular journalist, denounces them all as producing fake news and prevents them even coming in to press conferences. I think that is absolutely monstrous, because politicians should be open to questioning, should be open to challenge, and the media have a very important role in doing that. But the way in which the popular struggles of ordinary people are reported is very, very important. I remember the way in which the media reported the Liverpool dock strike. They were denounced as being Neanderthal, as looking after themselves, backward looking, not forward looking. The way in which the mining communities in Britain were monstered during the strike of 1984-85. What were they doing? Defending their communities, defending their living standards. They weren't even asking for a pay rise. They were asking to keep their jobs and to keep a balanced energy policy in Britain at that time. People who stand up for themselves tend to get monstered in the process. And eventually, as Tony Benn found in the latter part of his life, that you get abused, you get denied, you get denigrated, and then eventually you become a lovable national institution. And if permit me the liberty of one slight story, I remember after Tony had stood down from Parliament, he was given the freedom of the building by the Speaker, which was a very nice gesture. And he came into the tea room once and found John McDonnell and I having a cup of tea along with beans on toast. We knew how to live it up. And Tony comes shuffling in with his tray, with his usual completely odd form of food, which was a banana, a lump of cheese, a Mars bar, and a mug of tea. That was his lunch. And he comes shuffling in, and you look quite happy. I said, "Oh, Tony, you look pretty happy today. You okay? Everything going well?" He said, "Oh, yes. I've just had a death threat." I said, "What?" He said, "I've just had a death threat." I said, "Well, that's terrible." He said, "I know, but it shows how relevant I am." And it was that sort of humour that is often missing from our national media and the reporting of current affairs. Now, I know there's going to be some questions and discussion, and there's probably lots of things I've missed out in what should have been a comprehensive tour of all arts policy. I'll just finish with this thought. Last year, I went to Mahonmouth in mid Wales for the festival of El Sueño Existe, the dream exists. And it's a festival that's held every year in memory of the great Chilean poet, musician, and songwriter Victor Jara. Victor Jara sang the songs of the people of Chile in the late 1960s. And he then was part of the Popular Unity Campaign, which ended up with the government of Salvador Allende in 1970. And throughout that period, when Chile was building houses for the people for the first time, providing meals for children in school for the first time, and so many other things, Victor was there singing to people during the American economic blockade of Cuba, of Chile, but as they also did with Cuba. And then when the coup happened, Victor was arrested and taken to the National Stadium. And they took him out into the center to make an example of him and smashed his hands in front of everybody else so he could no longer play his guitar, and smashed his guitar. And he started singing, "El pueblo unido jamás será vencido." And then he was killed. Why did they kill Victor Jara? He was a slight man. He was not a physical threat to anybody. But his mind, the liberation he gave people through his music, that was a threat. That was a threat to the richest and most powerful. So when a child in school is allowed to write a poem, however bad or good somebody else decides it is, it's their expression of the reality of their lives. A lot of young people send me poetry. Some of it is very, very sad. I'm involved with a couple of local theatre groups, Angel Shed Theatre and others, where young people write their own plays. And some of those plays are very, very sad. They're plays about abuse, they're plays about poverty, they're plays about a feeling of underachievement, a feeling of being ignored by society. But they're giving us a message. They're giving us a message. We can and should do things differently. Arts is the most powerful message we've got. let's value it, and let's value festivals like this. And I love Zoom calls. I'm getting quite used to them. Actually, this little room here is where I do my work. But I'm actually looking forward to being out on the street again, doing that work there. But let's remember that during Corona crisis, a number of things have happened. People have been locked down, sure. They've been finding entertainment and culture with each other. They've been exploring all sorts of things on the internet and everywhere else. And they've also been taking part in lots of events by Zoom. Let's not lose the Zoom generation. Let's marry that into the physical presence at our concerts, at our music, at our meetings, at our rallies, at our events, because people should not be excluded. And let's use technology to make sure they're excluded. Thank you for inviting me. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. And let's remember, arts empower people. I want people to be empowered. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy. That was an incredibly in-depth and wide-ranging talk that you've just given us on the value of the arts. Incredible in the short time that you've been allocated. It's significant that you talked about the Dockers dispute, because that is the dispute that the idea of writing on the wall of this festival, in fact, was born. And it was in response really to the denigration of working class struggles that you talked about, and to give working class creativity and writers a space across the diverse spectrum. But I'd just like, now obviously questions are rolling in, you can imagine, but I'd just like to pick up on one of the points you talked about creativity in schools and the real importance of that to the development of children. Because I heard a teacher talking yesterday, I was at a Zoom event, and what she was saying was that this moment is one to move away from the constant testing culture that we are imposing, well, that society is imposing on our children right now, and to move to a more creative approach, because that's what's been happening under lockdown. Children have been more creative. Do you think that this situation presents such opportunities to move away from that testing culture?
I do, and I think the way in which the teachers' unions have spoken up about their concerns over a return to school too early, and when the danger of a further spread of corona is obviously very serious, I think their voice has been listened to. And it's interesting that 2 weeks ago, I was told that already 15,000 more teachers had joined the NEU because they were concerned about their own safety. But it's also called into question a whole lot about the testing culture. And as far as I'm concerned, and we developed this as a policy, Angela Rayner and myself, that we would end SATs testing in primary schools, and I announced that policy at the National Education Union conference in Liverpool. And at one level, it kind of sounds weird. A national politician turns up at a union conference and talks about SATs testing and gets a standing ovation, when quite a lot of the population of the country have no idea what SATs testing would be about. But it's so real for the stress it puts on very young children, and the way in reality it becomes almost a return to the 11 plus. I grew up in the era of the 11 plus, and I thought it was an appalling system then, and it would be an appalling system now. Let's have an education system that wants to get the best out of everybody, irrespective of what their perceived ability actually is. It is about education for all. If we over competitivize, if that's not a bit of a complicated word, education, then we end up with underachievement. There is a need to make sure that everybody feels valued in school and education. It's education for all that matters, and that also means that the principle of access to arts for all. not denying those that don't necessarily have great innate musical ability. Some people do, some don't. I don't, but I love music. They should have access to music as well. So I think it's important. And so I would end SATs, and also, as you obviously made clear, spend a good amount of money on arts and culture, because it does so much to inspire people.
Thank you for that answer. Just to go back to, you talked about film, and you mentioned Ken Loach, and I'll link this question to one that's coming in from our audience. We both know, I'm a big Ken Loach fan, he's been to our festival. We both know that artists who are producing art that is oppositional to the status quo, shall we say, they find it, even Ken Loach find it hard to get their work funded. But now, with the arts under such financial pressure, I just wonder how these artists will bring their work to the public. And it links to a question I've got on my screen from the audience that says, Jeremy, the dole used to provide artists with a bit of breathing space to create. What role should the state have in supporting working class artists to thrive? So I think that those two questions are linked.
Well, as you rightly say, even a prize-winning, world-famous, world-renowned film producer like Ken Loach struggles a bit to get funding for his projects. And if you think about it, it's quite astounding. I mean, Ken Loach's skill and ability is extraordinary. And I've worked with Ken on a number of things, and it's the most wonderful, lovely, and exasperating experience in your life, because he spends an awful lot of time talking to everybody in the group. I remember we make a film in Sheffield once, and I kind of naively thought we'd turn up there, we'd do the film, and we'd leave, after about an hour or something, we'd be done. Not a bit of it. Oh, no. Ken spent about an hour getting the audience talking to each other, talking about their lives, talking about their community, and so on, in order that it would be a better film. And when he makes his films, the whole group has to live together and work together while the film is being made. So when he made The Wind That Shakes the Barley, that was a whole group of people working and living together to understand what was happening in Ireland at that time, and so on, in all his films. And so I think the funding of it is important. Now, the Arts Council is there, but it's also funding of film. And British Film Institute, I think, has a role to play in this, as do others, where there would be funding available so that you do get that sort of that radical unknown filmmaker can get a chance to make something and get a showing for it, because otherwise our whole collective memory, our whole collective inspiration will be handed down from somewhere else, mainly Hollywood. And in post-war Europe, there was a lot of concern that Hollywood was too big and too powerful, and a lot of it was seen by some people as propaganda. Not all of it, some was. And so France in particular was very keen on funding its film industry in order to develop that whole genre of French filmmaking. Britain, to a lesser extent, although later on there was more funding for film and so on, and also the creative endeavor of our film industry. So I do think it is a question of funding for it, but it's also recognized this isn't a zero-sum game, because the creative industries in Britain employ a very large number of people. The creative industries making video games, that are making film, post-production work, and also the films on set all over the country, and the different places, locations that are used for films are also very big employers. And so development of arts and culture is a major part of our lives. I mean, look at the economy of Liverpool now, how it's changed. It's changed amazingly and in many ways. And Liverpool is a city of culture. has a huge number of visitors come there because it's such an exciting and creative place. You have great museums. The Slavery Museum is, I think, amazing. The Liverpool Museum itself is amazing, but also the history of the whole city that is portrayed in that way does bring people there. So it actually creates a lot of jobs in Liverpool as well. And therefore, the national galleries have begun to move partly away from London, the V&A opening up in Dundee as well as in London, also galleries in Cornwall and other places are important, but it is important to open up. And I would also say that museums are often very underfunded. Art galleries, particularly local art galleries, often chronically underfunded and barely open. And many of them have huge collections which never see the light of day. Well, goodness, these things they're hiding away are things that we all ought to see. Let's open it up a bit.
Thanks, and you're absolutely right. In Liverpool, we've been quite fortunate in that we have a city council who understands the value of art, and our mayor famously said, culture is the rocket fuel of the economy.
Yeah, I love that. Joe said that to me during one meeting I had with him, and I know that he is very keen on Liverpool's image as a city of music and culture, and I've often talked to Joe about that. And likewise, Steve Rotherham, as the city region mayor, himself a musician, is very keen on the whole region being seen as a place of cultural endeavour and cultural development. Let's keep that. Let's fund it properly.
Well, yeah, but at the same time, we are still impacted by national arts policy, arts organisations throughout the country. And you kind of talked about the type of elitist strategies that exist. And I've got a question here that says, there's an understanding that the art sector is going to look very different when we come out of this pandemic. What can we do to ensure that grassroots community arts organisations are a central part of that conversation? And it always does occur to me that the people who are making those policy decisions very rarely look like the communities that they represent. So what can we do to make policy formulation, I suppose, more grassroots and more in the hands of communities?
The strength of the question is in the last line, when you're saying that those making decisions very seldom look like the people that the decisions are being made, whose lives are going to be affected by it. There has to be a democratization of the arts, and there has to be real accessibility. As I said at the beginning, I quite like classical music, and I go to the proms every year usually, and go to one or two concerts, and always enjoy them. And then I look at the program. The program is huge, but the advertisements are all from the private education sector advertising how good the music teaching is in whichever private school is actually advertising. And well, this is just not right. There has to be an understanding that music is there for all of us. And so post-COVID, all of our theatres are in real problems because I'm talking to theatre producers and actors and so on all the time, and they're telling me that they obviously had to shut down when the lockdown started, understandable. That meant their whole production schedules are gone. And you can't just say, well, we're going to open the theatre tomorrow, June the 1st, open the theatres. Well, it doesn't quite work like that. You've got to rehearse, you've got to get the play ready, you've got to get the performance ready, and so on. It takes quite a lot of time. And so the costs of running the theatres run on for a very long time. Most theatres are telling me that they feel, even with the fairest possible wind in the end of COVID, they might be open for the pantomime season in December, more likely in January. So they're going to need funding to get through to there. It's not the same as restarting a production line or assembly line in a factory or reopening a retail place. It is obviously very complex. So I think the demands have to be made now that let's not forget the arts, not forget theatre, and also thank all those theatres that have managed to be done some quite innovative things of putting on virtual performances that we can watch online, putting on virtual music we can watch and listen to online, and have done so much to keep people informed and entertained during this crisis. So keep that pressure up for that. But the point about democracy of the arts is the point I was making about the way in which expenditure goes on the arts disproportionately to what's called high-end stuff based on the national scene and not enough on the local scene. In the poorest countries in the world, people do develop music because they get a small amount of seed corn funding to do it. I remember, forgive me this, going to Nicaragua in the 1980s during the midst of the war with the Contra. It was dangerous, there was fighting going on and so on. What was the government doing? Buying violins to help children in school learn music despite the war going on, because they said after the war there will be music for our children. Now we're not in the midst of a hot war in this country. We're in the midst of a global pandemic, which at some way or other affects most people, disproportionately the poorest. And so let's make sure we come out of the corona crisis with our arts and cultural scene not just intact but enhanced, and that we see the future for our country as one that is strong on arts and culture. And I believe it can be. But make your voice heard now. Get the letters going, get the emails going, get the petitions going now to support those theatres, support those orchestras, support those bands.
Thank you, Jeremy. Time is sadly running out. We do have another event on this evening with Levi to Far Right. I'm just going to finish by asking you if how has lockdown been for you? Have you discovered, with everything moving online, have you managed to catch anything that you wouldn't have perhaps managed to if you had to go there? And any recommendations for us?
Well, I normally spend my time traveling a great deal around the country and so on, and obviously that isn't happening. So my traveling is the journey once a week to my allotment, which is about half hour on a bicycle, maybe a bit less. And also walking to my local office, which is about 5 minutes away, and working in all of our food banks locally. So I've actually, the rest of the time I'm at home doing Zoom meetings and calls, which actually gives me more time. So I've always read a lot, but I've done far more reading over the last month or so than I've done for a long time. I read all the time anyway. And I've been reading an awful lot of history of communities and people's struggles. So that's been great. And what I've also found is that in the volunteers coming to help at the food banks, we've got, as I'm sure there are in all over Merseyside, we've got food banks working as food hubs out of each of our community centres, and we deliver food to people that can't get out to the shops to buy it or haven't got enough money to buy it. And it's been a total eye-opener of people who always thought they were kind of all right, suddenly find they're not, and they have to apply to a food bank to get some food in order to get through the week, and we've been delivering it to them. Some people come to the door very embarrassed because they think, this is not what I ever expected to be doing in my life, but also a realization of the strength of community. And the volunteers are such an incredible mixture of people. That's something that I think is empowering and strong. And so for me, Corona crisis has taught us all a lot of things. If we carry on as an unequal country in an even more unequal world, then there will be another coronavirus coming somewhere else. So recognize the importance of the World Health Organization and others to invest in healthcare for all. And also never again, never, please, describe cleaners as unskilled workers. Without them, it would be much worse.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. You mentioned food banks, and I'll just take the opportunity to remind people that if they want to donate to Writing on the Wall on this online festival, part of those proceeds are going to fans supporting food banks. Jeremy, I just want to say a huge thank you. You started by saying at the beginning, you hope that you could come back when you can come back in person, and we would absolutely have you like a shot. Thank you very much for your contribution tonight, and take care now. And now, thank you, Jeremy. I'm going to bring on my co-director, Mike Morris, just to do our normal annual festival thanks. And this has been a fantastic event and a fantastic festival, and I'm sure, and we have got a lot of thanks to do.
All right. First off, thanks, Jeremy. That was a fantastic speech and incredibly inspirational. Want to say a huge thanks to everybody first who's taken part and supported WoWFEST lockdown.
Yeah, we've held 33 events featuring over 60 artists, and all of this has been pulled together in just 2 weeks after we had to cancel our live festival.
A huge thanks to all the artists and the guests who took part in the discussions and performances. We're truly grateful for how they all responded to our call out.
As ever, audiences are at the heart of what we do, and our decision to hold an online festival during this pandemic has really paid off. We've had great audiences for our live events, and the amount of people watching the videos is incredible, which will increase once they're up on YouTube.
As Madeline mentioned before, we're really grateful to all those who have made donations, be it from £2 to £100. And to date, we have raised near on £4,000, which will be split between fan support and food banks, the South Liverpool Domestic Abuse Services, and Writing on the Wall. Please keep the donations coming in. You really are helping those organisations to continue their vital work.
And thank you to all our project participants, those in Right to Work, Moving Forward, Life of Grime, our superheroes, Words Are Our Power, from Orbiter to Orbital. Being able to support you during this time is as important to us as our festival work.
We're very grateful, and we want to acknowledge the support from our funders, the Institute of Creative Enterprise at Edgehill University, Unison Northwest, the School of Writing at Liverpool John Moores University, Arts Council England, the Esme Fairbairn Foundation, Granada Foundation, the Paul Hamlin Foundation. We wouldn't be able to develop our festival programme and our projects without the support of so many people from these organisations.
And finally, we want to say thank you to our trustees for their support, and a massive thank you and offer our congratulations to all of our staff for the work that they've done and continue to do. And they are Emma Hume, Alice Mason, Kieran Hodges, Amy Carrington, Alice Bunker-Whitney, Lauren Buxton, Katrina Patterson, and Zach Bahia. And really, they've gone above and beyond during this very difficult time to deliver great art and culture, engage people in creative activities, and reach out and to work with individual communities, this time across the world during this very difficult time. We couldn't be more proud to be part of this team.
Also like to say thanks to our trustees for the support that they give us right throughout the year and also for the festival. Please continue to send your donations and feedback. We really value it. There'll be a link put up in the comments page for both donations and feedback. Please send the donations in. Please submit your feedback. It really helps us shape our work.
And this is the last evening of WoWFEST for this year, but our work continues, and we have some really exciting announcements for new projects beginning from next week.
So please stay tuned on our Facebook page after this. We're finishing here now, but in approximately 10 minutes time, we have a very, very special performance from Liverpool's own urban griot, Levi Tafari, who's going to be performing a live lockdown set from his living room for you for your Sunday night pleasure. From all of us at Writing on the Wall, thanks again. Please stay safe and stay connected.